Welcome to the Ethics and Responsible Business Forum. Our program will begin shortly. Please make yourself comfortable. Thank you for joining the Ethics and Responsible Business Forum. We are recording this session and your participation is your waiver. Before we get started today, we would like to review some Zoom housekeeping items. At the end of the presentation, there will be a live Q&A session with our speakers and panelists. You can submit a question now and at any time throughout the webinar using the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar as shown on the screen. Please note, your questions will reach our moderator directly. You will only be able to see the questions that you have asked into the Q&A box. Questions answered live by our panelists and speakers will then appear in the Answered tab. Closed captioning is available for today's webinar. To view the live closed captioning, use the live transcript icon located in your Zoom toolbar as shown on the screen. There are options to view subtitles or the full transcript, and you may adjust the font size as desired. If you're having trouble viewing this webinar and need assistance, please email specialevents@csumb.edu. One of our team members is monitoring that email and will respond to assist you. And now to get our program started, please help me welcome your MC for this afternoon, Professor Jeff Froshman from California State University, Monterey Bay's College of Business.
Good afternoon, vast viewing audience, and welcome to the 19th Annual Ethics and Responsible Business Forum. Black Lives Matter. Is the U.S. social contract broken? This forum is brought to you by the College of Business, the College of Science, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and the College of Health Sciences and Human Services. I'm your host and moderator, Professor Jeffrey Froshman from the College of Business. It was my honor to be the MC at the very first ethics conference back in 2003, and continues to be a privilege to be here with all of you today. Our event will begin with each keynote speaker giving their opening statements and remarks, followed by our panel giving us follow-up commentary and then questions to our keynotes. At the end of the presentation, there will be a live Q&A session with our speakers and panelists. You can submit a question now or at any time throughout our program. Use the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar as shown on the screen. You, the attendees, will only be able to view the questions that you yourself have asked. Therefore, your questions that I ask our panel and speakers will appear in your Answered tab of the Q&A box. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Business, Dr. Shyam Kamath.
Hello and good afternoon. It is my privilege and honor to welcome you to our 19th Ethics and Responsible Business Forum on behalf of my fellow deans of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science and the College of Health Sciences and Human Services, the College of Science, as well as my college, the College of Business. This event epitomizes the values of critical inquiry, independent thinking, and community engagement embedded in the founding vision of our university. This year's forum focuses on the key issue of our time. Is our country's social contract guaranteeing life, liberty, justice, and the pursuit of happiness for all broken because of the inequality, injustice, and racism that Black citizens face on a daily and continuing basis? The answer to this question lies at the heart of our democracy and civil society. It is the central moral and ethical issue of our time. This pivotal question will be deeply examined today by our two keynote speakers, Professor Rick Banks of Stanford Law School and Mr. Jason Riley of the Manhattan Institute. They will be questioned by a distinguished panel consisting of CSU MB professors John Berteau and Vanessa Lopez Littleton, and CSU MB student leader Darchelle Burnett. My fellow deans and I are very grateful for their participation today. I congratulate the organizing committee consisting of faculty members from all four of our colleges, led ably by Professor Angie Nariswari of the College of Business, for putting together this event and for their choice of topics, keynote speakers, and the panelists. I would also like to thank Professor Jeff Froshman of CSU MB for being our MC extraordinaire today, and our staff team of Cindy Donahue, Susan Mangan, and Yvonne Bantam for their superb organizational and technical support for this event. Of course, I'm very grateful to my fellow deans for their sponsorship of the event and the participation of their faculty in organizing it. And to all of you here today for listening to this debate and asking your incisive questions. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of CSU Monterey Bay, Dr. Eduardo Ochoa. Dr. Ochoa has led our university's focus and thrust on serving minority groups, aligning our programs and priorities towards diversity, equity, and inclusion as a minority serving and Hispanic serving institution. We have over 70% non-white students and a predominantly underrepresented minority and first-generation student population. He has been a champion for equity and justice and has led our university to make it have a huge community impact while also making it one of the most innovative and exciting campuses in the CSU system. Dr. Ochoa.
Thank you, Dean Kamath, for those kind remarks. I'm very happy to join you today for this very important forum. You know, the US Declaration of Independence articulated a transformational idea in human history. It affirmed the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. It represented a break from millennia of hierarchical thought and hierarchical societies. It inspired transformations, democratic revolutions throughout the world. But the idea remained aspirational. As the nation was founded, it contained a poison fruit, our original sin, slavery. It ultimately led to the Civil War, which did lead to the abolition of slavery. However, as our democracy was being reconstructed, that process was arrested in the aftermath of the Civil War, and a long period of segregation and racial inequality and injustice ruled over the land. Finally, in the late 50s and early 60s, the civil rights movement started to melt some of those frozen structures, culminating in the civil rights legislation passed during the Johnson administration. But at the same time, the reaction to this progress started. And over decades, political polarization in the US has increasingly aligned itself over racial issues, culminating with the previous administration. Fueled by deep-rooted social, economic, and cultural issues stemming from decades of tense race relations, which were exacerbated during the last 4 years, and propelled by social media, Black Lives Matter has rapidly evolved from a Twitter hashtag into this generation's civil rights movement. Started in 2013 by Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Black youngster Trayvon Martin. The BLM movement has shifted from the internet to the streets and the mainstream to highlight the injustice of the killing of Black men by police and vigilantes, as well as the daily unequal treatment of Black people. The BLM movement strives to transform society into a world where the lives and contributions of all individuals are recognized equally. In other words, to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. It has gained momentum after the shootings of Michael Brown and John Crawford III and the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner. The press and the social media have highlighted that Black citizens face inequality, injustice, and racism on a daily basis. Is the US founding social contract broken? Or will the injustices experienced by Black people be corrected as we move closer to the ideal of equal treatment and social justice for all? This and the related questions of racial, economic, and social inequality, of racially skewed health and social outcomes, of unequal treatment before the law, of the viability and desirability of reparations are at the center of the challenges raised by the BLM movement. The answers to these questions lie at the heart of the survival and vitality of our democracy and our civil society. They are central moral issues of our time. I am encouraged by the fact that the College of Business, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, the College of Health Sciences and Human Services, and the College of Science have gotten together again to host the 19th Annual Ethics and Responsible Business Forum. By taking on the key issues, such as today's topic, they provide the means and opportunity for an outstanding interdisciplinary ethical education at CSUMB, as called for by our founding vision statement. By bringing two outstanding scholars and thought leaders to debate the issue with questions from three of our own thought leaders, I'm pleased to see that we are engaging the critical thinking capacities of our students and constituents. The ability to think critically and make up one's own mind is the touchstone of a great university and of democracy itself. The use of reason and civil discourse to debate controversial issues is the hallmark of an enlightened society. I would like to thank Professor Richard Banks and Dr. Jason Riley for being here today to debate this critical current issue. I also want to thank our own doctors, John Berteau and Vanessa Lopez Littleton, as well as Darshell Burnett, CAHSS student and president of Black Students United and Native American Students United, for being our panelists and contributing to an illuminating and civil dialogue on today's topic. In addition, I thank the cross-college organizing committee, and the deans and faculty members of the 4 participating colleges for organizing this forum on the key question of our times. And now I ask our MC extraordinaire, Professor Jeff Roshman of the College of Business, to come back and launch the forum for us.
Thank you, President Ochoa. And now let me please introduce our first keynote speaker. Debating for the motion that our social contract has been broken is Ralph Richard Banks. Ralph Richard Banks is the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, the co-founder and faculty director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, and professor by courtesy at the School of Education. Professor Banks teaches and writes about family law, employment discrimination law, and race and the law. He is the author of Is Marriage for White People? How the African-American Marriage Decline Affects Everyone. His writings have appeared in a wide range of popular and scholarly publications, and he has been interviewed and quoted by numerous print and broadcast media. Rick, welcome to our forum.
It is a pleasure. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Let me start by just telling you how excited I am to discuss this important and timely topic. But before I launch into that, I should take a moment to thank everyone who has organized this event. Even though we're just at the outset, this has been an extraordinarily well-done event, which, as your dean has mentioned, takes many people working together to make it run smoothly. And you all have been a model of a seamless operation. So thank you, everyone behind the scenes, for making this happen. As a law professor and a teacher of constitutional law as well, I am acutely aware of the fact that the United States is a very special place. As your president mentioned, our founding documents are bold and visionary. The Declaration of Independence speaks of truths that are self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution, which is actually our governing document, begins with the words, "we the people." Those 3 words stand as a testament to the democratic character of our nation. Now, it's easy to criticize these statements. After all, they certainly weren't true when they were written. As we know, slavery predominated in the colonies. In fact, all of our original colonies at one point or another had slavery. And my own ancestors were among those enslaved. So I'm very well aware that the words written in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were not literally true. We may also take these statements for granted now. We may think that those principles are no big deal. We become so accustomed to them. But in fact, we should never lose sight of how extraordinary those founding documents are. How unprecedented was the vision and the hopes that they embodied. Those documents created a set of promises that bind our nation even now. They are a set of promises that most nations do not make. They represent a set of ideals that most nations do not embody. It is precisely because we make such promises that the death of George Floyd, coming as it did on the heels of so many other instances of horrific police brutality, shocked people not only here, but throughout the world. Black Lives Matter originated as a movement in the United States, but it resonated worldwide. Protests sprang up in the United Kingdom, in France, and in many countries throughout Asia. The widespread protests that span the world reflect the extent to which many people the world over felt that in some fundamental way, there was some promise that was being broken, some aspiration, which all these years after the end of slavery remained yet unfulfilled. The title of the topic today is a social contract. And when we talk about the social contract in our nation, we are talking about the American dream. There are many ways to articulate that American dream. We can speak of the belief in the possibility of progress. We can think of the idea that every parent wants their child's life to be better than their own. We can think about the idea of our nation always acting to promote justice, liberty, and the general welfare. Underneath all of those various articulations of the American dream is the idea of faith in the democratic project, a belief that we are always in the process of creating a more perfect union. It's only because of this American dream and the way in which it pulls and tugs at all of us that Martin Luther King was able, half a century ago, more in fact, to so effectively articulate his American dream. I was born not long after Martin Luther King articulated that American dream. And I have always had faith in it. I inherited that faith from my parents. My mother and father were both refugees from the Jim Crow South. My mother was born in Alabama and my father in Georgia. They both fled the South when they were young. They went north to Cleveland, where I grew up, in search of opportunity. Although life in Cleveland presented its own set of challenges, there was racism in the North too. My parents, nonetheless, were able to launch me on a life of possibility and opportunity that they could scarcely have imagined. I benefited from the unprecedented laws that were passed during the Civil Rights era. The Voting Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My students would not forgive me. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. These were among the laws that opened a path for me to have a better life than my parents. But recently, as I think about my own children, King's words have been echoing in a different way. I think not so much of his dream, but of our failure to live up to it. Half a century after the Civil Rights Movement, it's easy to believe, to see that the social contract has been broken with respect to African Americans. After the death of George Floyd, the ensuing protests quickly extended beyond issues of policing. As well they should have. You see, mass incarceration has become a primary shaper of contemporary Black life. This is the criminal justice challenge of our day. I can't help but think of this in a personal way. You see, I have 3 sons now. And I recall that some years ago, not that long ago, the statistician looked at the trends in incarceration in our nation. And he looked at the racial demographics of the people who were going to jail. And the conclusion was that based on current patterns and trends, 1 in 3 Black boys would spend some time in jail or prison. 1 in 3. And I have 3 sons. Our rates of incarceration as a nation have reached levels that literally would have seemed unimaginable from the standpoint of the civil rights era. Not only have things not gotten better, they've gotten worse, a lot worse. Think of what this means for all the people who go to jail, for their families, for their partners, for their children, for their parents. These are lives destroyed. These people are disproportionately African American. We are roughly 5% of the world's population, yet we are 25% of its prisoners. That's a statistic which quite literally puts us off the chart. We imprison so many more people per capita than our European counterparts that we can't even be on the same chart. While incarceration has gotten worse since the civil rights era, there are other indicators that one would have expected, given the laws that were passed, to improve, yet they haven't. I think here of racial disparities in wealth, a marker of so much else in life, the culmination of inequalities in economic opportunity, in job availability, in education availability. The average net worth today of the average white family remain 10 times that, the average net, 10 times that of the average net worth of the Black family. That's quite a disparity. And especially disparity is the fact that racial differences in net worth exist, even when you compare people of similar educational levels. Let me be clear. The racial difference in net worth is not simply a consequence of the fact that African Americans are disproportionately likely not to be highly educated, and that wealth is associated with being highly educated. Even if we look at people of the same educational level, who've invested the same amount of time and energy in their schooling, we find these extraordinary differences in wealth. This is but one marker of a broad array of racial inequalities that are either not getting better, or in some cases, as with incarceration, are getting worse. But the problem is not only, in fact, that the social contract is broken with respect to African Americans, because that problem, the racial problem, is actually nested within and emblematic of a larger problem. That larger problem is one of economic inequality within American society. The challenge here is to connect racial injustice and economic injustice, and to understand how they are parasitic upon each other. Our unwillingness to recognize that connection has always stood between us and our creation of a more perfect union. The failure to recognize that coupling of racial injustice and economic injustice is, in a sense, the source of extraordinary polarization and division that now plagues American society. During the last many decades, the rich really have gotten a lot richer. The rising incomes of the rich are a big part of what accounts for their extraordinary accumulation of wealth. Now, I don't begrudge anyone their success. I certainly want to be successful myself, and I want other people to have opportunities to be successful. But these extraordinary sorts of inequalities in income and in wealth have diminished the hopes of people throughout our society. We've created a society that, in fact, only works for a small portion of its population. Most people of all races are on the underside of our system. These people of all races have begun to believe that the system is rigged. They have begun to expect that their elected officials will not care about them. They believe that they don't have much chance to get ahead. They expect, sadly, that they will not even live as long as their parents, and that the lives of their children will not be better than theirs. The saddest part of all of this is that in many respects, these beliefs are correct. If that's not a broken social contract, then I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And now, let me please introduce our second keynote speaker. Debating against the motion that our social contract has been broken is Jason Riley. Jason Riley is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a public policy think tank focused on urban affairs. He is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, where he has written about politics, economics, education, immigration, and social inequality for more than 20 years. He is also a frequent public speaker and provides commentary for television and radio news outlets. After joining the Journal, Mr. Riley was named a senior editorial page writer and a member of the editorial board. The author of 4 books, he has also worked for USA Today and the Buffalo News. A warm welcome to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to participate. I'm happy that this event has invited someone to offer an alternative perspective on some of these topics. It's not something I think we can take for granted these days, particularly in the university setting. So I'm glad that you decided to invite someone with my views. And I also want to thank Professor Banks for participating. I think you're going to see some overlap in some of what we say on this topic, and particularly some references to some individuals, which is a little surprising since I didn't know what his remarks would be. But I thought I'd begin with a personal anecdote that might give you some idea of how I think about the subject we're discussing today. A few years ago, I wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal on the prevalence of violent crime in poor Black neighborhoods. And in the column, I used a quote from Martin Luther King, who once said to a Black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" King said. He said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the Black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." So after the column ran, a number of readers contacted the paper and accused me of making up the quotes, which come from a 1961 profile of King written by the famous Black author James Baldwin in Harper's Magazine. Now, I was a little surprised by this reaction because all you have to do these days is Google something to find the source. But what really struck me about the accusation is that the people making it apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the Black community. and the role of personal responsibility. In fact, what King said was quite typical of how Black civil rights leaders spoke at the time, even when addressing other Black people. And there's a sharp contrast between that and what you are much more likely to hear today. King represented a type of leadership, a type of thinking, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that politicians and social activists today barely even give lip service to. King and his generation of leaders believed that whites obviously had a role to play in changing a fundamentally racist system. But they also understood that Blacks had a role to play, and they were willing to hold Blacks accountable despite the white racism, the legal and rampant white racism that existed at the time. They asked something of Black people. They operated under the belief and tried to instill in young people the belief that Blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers. The Blacks can't just sit around waiting for whites to get their act together first. When I think about the social contract, I think about those comments from King, because what he was saying doesn't only apply to Blacks. It's a much more universal message. Whether the social contract is broken probably depends on individual circumstances. If you're part of the Black underclass, you probably say yes. But then you probably say yes if you're part of the white underclass, living in a community in Kentucky or West Virginia or Ohio that's been ravaged by the opioid addiction. You probably say yes if you're Hispanic and take issue with what's currently going on the southern border. You probably say yes if you're Asian and have a problem with these recent violent attacks that we've seen, or the fact that Harvard makes Asian applicants score higher on the SAT than other groups to be admitted. But whether the social contract is broken also depends on your expectations. What is the social contract supposed to accomplish? What would the country look like if the social contract wasn't broken? And that's why I think King's comments are instructive. What he was saying is, yes, there are problems in the larger society with other groups, but that can't be our only concern or even our primary concern. Our primary concern must be to get our own act together. We need to look in the mirror and be honest with ourselves. It's got to start there. That's not a message you hear a lot today from Black activists, who primarily want other people to look in the mirror. The focus is almost exclusively on white racism and using it as an all-purpose explanation for racial inequality. Many of the activists and politicians today who express concern about the plight of the Black underclass ask almost nothing of Black people themselves. They spend much more time making excuses for the kind of antisocial behavior that prominent Black leaders of the King era regularly condemned. Young Black kids are sent out into the world with a chip on their shoulders. They're told the cops are gunning for them. The teachers are racist. The tests are racist. The employers are racist. The judges and prosecutors and entire justice system is stacked against them. They're told that the world owes them and that if they don't succeed, it's not their fault. The irony is that we live at a time when Black people have opportunities, as Professor Banks said, that King's generation could only dream about. Young Blacks today are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial prejudice. And at a time when you have a generation of Blacks who came of age with a twice-elected Black president, we have people in positions of influence and authority insisting that Blacks can't be held in any way responsible for these persistent racial gaps until white racism has been essentially vanquished from America. In many cases, you're dealing with Black leaders and activists who consider any focus on Black responsibility or accountability to be itself a form of racism. And the academic and political and media establishments, for the most part, play right along. Now, it's not a mystery, at least to me, why activists want to keep the focus on white racism. It helps them raise money. It helps them stay relevant. And it's not a mystery why politicians use the same tactics, because it helps them win votes. But it's not clear at all that a laser focus on white racism is helping the Black underclass. You can spend all day, every day, pointing out that racism still exists in America, or the moral failings of other groups and other people and other institutions and society in general. But it's not clear to me that doing so helps the people who most need help. Most of today's activists go about their business with the assumption that the only real problem facing the Black underclass is white racism. I think that's a mistake. The recent focus on policing in Black communities is a good example. Do racist cops exist? Absolutely. But are poor Black communities so violent because of racist cops? And will reducing police resources improve the situation? According to the Chicago Sun-Times, there were 492 homicides in Chicago in 2019. Do you know how many of them involve police? 3. 3 out of 492. During one weekend in Chicago a couple years ago, 74 people were shot in one weekend. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down, turn away ambulances because it didn't have room for any more bodies. Again, none of these shootings involved cops, not one. Young Black men in Chicago or Baltimore or St. Louis may indeed leave the house each morning worried about getting shot, but not by police. And will reducing police resources really solve the problem? Downplaying group behavioral differences or shielding people from any responsibility for their situation may seem like the charitable thing to do in light of all the atrocities that Blacks have endured in the United States. But the relevant question is whether it's helpful. More than anything else, the Black underclass needs the human capital, the values, the habits, the attitudes, the behaviors that facilitate economic advancement. And that involves having honest conversations about things that have little or nothing to do with the social contract. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. To engage with our keynote speakers, I would now like to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists. Dr. John Berteau, our resident ethicist, teaches philosophy here at CSUMB. He is a frequent panelist at our ethics forum, and we are delighted to have him return once again. John has written about race and liberal political theory. His most recent article is entitled Humanistic Inquiry, Reconciling Reality, Knowledge, and Imagination. Welcome, Dr. Berteau. Darchelle Burnett is a CSUMB student and known within our community as a rising scholar. Now in her senior year, she has exemplified Black excellence through student activism, academics, research, and partnerships that drive her to strengthen her knowledge and connection to both her Black and Choctaw history. In May, she will be obtaining a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in social and behavioral sciences and a concentration in anthropology with a minor in peace studies. In her list of accomplishments, Darchelle has been an advocate for social justice, a lead organizer for Monterey County's Youth Summit Race to Equity, and the president of both Black Students United and Native Students United. Welcome, Ms. Burnett. Dr. Vanessa Lopez Littleton is our chair of the Department of Health, Human Services, and Public Policy here at CSUMB. Her area of expertise is health equity and seeking solutions to problems rooted in connections between health and neighborhood factors. She teaches and writes on the health consequences of political, economic processes such as poverty, inequality, and racism. Dr. Lopez Littleton's active participation in designing innovative graduate and undergrad programs encourages diverse teams to develop inclusive classroom and academic practices. She is also a U.S. Army veteran, and thank you for your service, and a registered nurse. Welcome, Dr. Lopez Littleton. We will now have our panelists engage in asking our keynote speakers questions regarding the important topics and issues that have been raised. They will begin each with a 5-minute discussion, and we will begin with panelist John Berteau.
Is the social contract broken? I want to change the question slightly. I want to ask, does the existence of racial groups pose special problems for liberalism and the way that liberal theory gets interpreted? Is the view that justice is secured and the state made legitimate via an agreement of citizens or citizens and the rulers of the state altered by the existence of vulnerable groups? It seems to me that it's a truism to say that whether racial identity is compatible or how compatible it is with liberal ideology depends on how one defines race, racism, and the ideals in question. For example, is race something or is it nothing? If it's nothing, why do I see it? And if it's something, what do I see when I see it? The questions that come up all the time. In 1971, a popular, I should say famous book came out, A Theory of Justice. It was written by a philosopher, John Rawls. In the opening pages of the book, he tells us its purpose. He says, my ambition for the book will be completely realized if it enables one to see more clearly the structural features of an alternative conception of justice that is implicit in the social contract tradition and paints the way to its further elaboration. Rawls says he believes contract theory best approximates our considered judgments of justice and constitutes the most appropriate moral basis for a democratic society. He then tells us that if we're to see, that if we're to see more clearly the structural features of this alternative conception of justice, we must abstract from all that is characteristically human and social. I took him to mean race, gender, sexuality, class, all of that. Now, I'm not the first to ask, do we really want to do that? Moreover, is this sort of abstraction even possible? You see, one of the things I'm suggesting is that there are conditions of our existence that are invisible. For example, there are forms of power that are hidden from the individual, unearned advantage. If power is constitutive of the identity of groups and yet obscured, how should or can we alter power relationships to overcome racism? Will it be sufficient to change the economic, the social, or the political circumstances of the members of vulnerable groups? Or do we have to change the person at the deepest level? Well, that depends on how you define these things, race, racism, and the ideals in question. The other thing is that I'm trying to point to here is that the subjective character of an experience is not reducible to the physical. There's a difference between hearing the facts and knowing the details. I'm pessimistic about change. To me, it seems that racism is like cancer. In the 2016 election, as well as the events leading up to and following the 2020 election, all of these things suggest that this cancer has metastasized. It ain't going away. Things may seem to get a little better for a little while. We take a couple of steps forward, and then there are a series of events that suggest little has changed. We take a step backward. Today, we're focusing on the excruciating death of George Floyd. Yet I know I'm not alone when I say I've seen this over and over again. In 1964, I was a junior in high school when James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were brutally murdered by a sheriff and his buddies outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Of course, their deaths led to, as somebody's mentioned earlier, the federal government. It led to the federal government to pass the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a couple of steps forward. However, as little as 15 years after that, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan decided that he would announce his candidacy for president of the United States by touting states' rights and the ability to work and the ability of people to work out their problems without federal government involvement. Not by chance, he picked Philadelphia, Mississippi to make the announcement. He chose as his campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again." A step back. So when you ask me, has the US broken its social contract with Black Americans? Looking at the history, my feeling is that I doubt if there has ever been a social contract with Black Americans. Closer to the fact is something that philosopher Charles Mills argues. We're looking at a racial contract, or as philosopher Carol Pateman argues, we're looking at a gender contract. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Darshell Burnett. Darshell is a student at CSUMB, and she is also the president of Black Students United.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Howdy and howdy do. My name is Darshell Burnett. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you once again for inviting me here today and providing this time for us to share in our truths while also engaging in respectful conversation about the state of injustices in America. This year, I've had the extraordinary opportunities to share my story, dive into self-reflection, partake in the development of my identifying communities, and more. I have grown to love collaborating and sharing space, as well as we have created these opportunities for other scholars and students to express their communal injustices and their individual experiences that have shaped their global perspectives. I have even had the opportunity to share my educational and social experiences with many of my family members, which led to new understandings and revised perspectives. I've even had also the opportunity to share my perspective about Black excellence, which was through Associated Students at the Otter Talks earlier this semester. But unfortunately, this will all mean nothing if we limit ourselves this collaborative experience for only 2 to 3 years. To me, these ongoing historical and current conflicts are in my mind as unhealable wounds. We, as a society, have continued to apply loose bandages that only create temporary solutions, when what we really need, or as we should better say what we really deserve, is stitches that could hold us together while we take the proper time to internally repair the systemic injustices. In a way, the US social contract has not been broken because I too believe that it has never been properly written. Yes, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and yes, it has increased the abilities of many individuals of color in the US, but it did not disperse the day-to-day injustices that many folks, especially Black and Brown people, have had to live through. There's still, unfortunately, room left for subtle, direct, and indirect racism to occur. And within each generation, it is defined differently, but it still runs similarly. Specifically at CSUMB and on the Monterey Bay Peninsula, I have seen a major increase of programming that has been directed towards engaging Black voices and learning about anti-Blackness. Starting from the start of the Center of Black Student Success to pretty much now at this event, we have seen several events set as a platform for scholars and students, but it should not have taken this long or it should not have taken the movements of 2020 to spark what we're doing here today. For many who believe that there is a social contract between America and Black populations, often draw at Black History Month to validate that the contract is running smoothly, when in reality, it only shows me personally how little information that folks outside of the community actually know. Some school curriculums, I'm speaking about K through 12, or social media campaigns for companies constantly circulates the same few names: Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and then more recently, John Lewis, Angela Davis, Oprah Winfrey, Maya Angelou, just to name a few of the most common names. I recently said something similar to a local newspaper, and someone had responded with, "Does she teach about Clarence Thomas or Larry Elder or Thomas Sowell?" When I had initially read that, I laughed because I am still on my own journey of learning about Black history and all who encompass it, meaning the folks who are LGBTQIA+, who are multiracial, who are part of different political parties and who have won their fights. And two, I've never said to exclude those people in learning about Black pedagogy and Black realities. That moment truly broadcasted to me how many are always on the defense to say that they themselves are doing enough or that we Black folks aren't doing enough. The same goes for my classes, where other Black peers can call upon similar experiences at least once in their life when they're asked to share history about a particular moment or a particular person just because they themselves were Black. And if there is, or if there was a social contract in the US and it was directed primarily at young adults and college students and other emerging scholars and pioneers, it should be written to support the healing processes or for the traumatic experiences. And I mean all traumatic experiences, especially the ones that we are still learning about today. And education should be constant and draw towards teaching about Black history throughout the year, as it is intersecting with much curriculum in K through 12, also within higher education. And as a student leader, I have committed myself to these ideas of education, drawing on my various experiences to make sense of the world that I see while being able to be mindful about the world that my Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and queer peers see as well. And I also did want to mention that as far as the development of Black communities goes and the specific relationship between white Americans with status and Black people, I encourage y'all to reflect back on the marketing that you could kind of see on our pictures. On one hand, you have, on this side, I think, on one hand, you have former US President William McKinley, and on the other, you have a portrait of Harriet Tubman. I tend to read a lot into these images, and I'm going to try to make sense of what I see. So in my perspective, McKinley is representing white America who makes all the decisions using the voice, but they do not take a moment to truly see the decisions that they're making and how they're playing out for the communities that it's going to be affecting. And for Tubman, she to me represents the Black and African Americans who theoretically have no voice, and we are constantly trying to break that every day, but we have to be silent as we watch gentrification, policies, politics, police brutality take over and disrupt our communities. I want to thank you so much for allowing me this space, and I believe that up next is the wonderful Dr. Vanessa Lopez Littleton, which is one of my mentors, one of my research mentors.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Darshell. So thank you to all of my esteemed colleagues for your thoughtful and engaging comments. I would argue that the social contract is indeed broken. From my purview, it's been broken for a while, and I'll agree with Dr. Berteau and with Darshell, if it ever existed, right? And so for decades, Black Americans have been relegated to a sort of second-class citizenship status based on a socially constructed category that has very real consequences for non-white people. And this dates back to 1863. While Abraham Lincoln argued that slavery was a monstrous injustice and a moral, social, and political evil, he was not a supporter of equal rights. In fact, he clearly stated that he was not in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races. He argued that the physical differences would forever prohibit their ability to live together in terms of social and political equality. The enduring legacy of slavery remains embedded within many American institutions, with the same harm and injurious outcomes as was evident before the proclamation was signed. And we see this across a number of institutions, public and private. So I am not suggesting that we as a society have not evolved. We have, but there remains much to do in advancing us towards a more just and equitable society. And this is particularly true when it comes to health outcomes, where Black Americans are at greater risk of injury, illness, disease, and death than their white counterparts. As a college-educated Black woman, I am more likely to have an adverse pregnancy outcome than a white woman with less than a high school education. These are not economic issues, as these trends persist without regard to income, education, or insurance status. These data are not explained away by focusing on social economics, genetic differences, or even vitamin D deficiencies. Black women experience bias, mistreatment, and differing levels of care within the healthcare system. This is not my supposition. These are facts. These are moral concerns with decades of data that support the existence of disparate outcomes that are unfair, unjust, and unnecessary. Contractarian ethics, Kantian ethics, and utilitarian ethics provide theoretical justification for viewing health disparities as morally wrong. Recent evidence has shown that Black women are more likely to have better pregnancy outcomes when they have a Black healthcare provider. And so my final comment is this. COVID-19 has been devastating to the Black community, so much so that the life expectancy of Black people has declined by 3 years. Black people are hospitalized at 3 times the rate of white Americans and die at twice the rate. Yet there is no national strategy to prioritize the vaccine for Black Americans. This is a moral concern. So from my purview as a healthcare professional and educator, I say the social contract is broken, and without intentional efforts to dismantle systemic racism, it will remain broken. So I thank you for your time, and I will now hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, panelists. So we're not going to let the panelists leave us quite yet. For the next 35 to 40 minutes, we're going to have our panelists question the keynote speakers, and we're going to go back and forth hearing different views from panelist questions. So to get the ball rolling on this, I'll turn to my colleague, Dr. John Berteau.
Here.
John, if you can hear me, we need you to unmute, please.
How's that?
There you go, a silent professor, no such thing. So thanks for coming back to this.
What I was saying is that I don't have an answer to this question, but it's just in talking about this, the question comes up. How do we reconcile, or let me put it another way, is it possible to reconcile history and social contract theory? Yeah, and I think I'm thinking about Professor, for this question, Professor Blake, is it? Richard? Rick?
Oh, Banks, that's me. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. For some reason, I cannot show my video though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let's get the camera on Rick there, please. I see Jason's on camera, so that's good.
Okay, here we go. So thank you all for those thoughtful comments. The comments stirred so much in me. I'll just offer just a little bit of that on the question of Rawls. And, in some sense, Rawls is asking us when he talks about going behind the veil of ignorance, right, to construct society, he's really asking us to value others as our own brothers and sisters, to think of everyone as though we're linked by common humanity, rather than clinging to our own sense of what our position is. And I do think that, race has always been, and in some ways continues to be, what stands in the way of our ability to think of all of our countrymen as our brothers and sisters. And that's been what's divided us going all the way back to slavery, as Professor Lopez Littleton mentioned. Back then, lots of Black people were slaves. Most white people were not owners of slaves, in fact, throughout the nation. Many white people were actually competing against slaves. One of the things that racism did, the magic of racism, the seductiveness of racism, was that racism convinced white people that they were better off being white and poor rather than joining hands with their Black counterparts and trying to make the entire system more just. And so race has always stood in the way. But the fact that race has always stood in the way of our joining hands actually doesn't mean that it always will stand in the way. Professor Berteau, you mentioned, I think, that you weren't so optimistic. And I share some of that sense of not being as optimistic as I would have been 20, 30 years ago. But I also am hopeful. And I've realized over time that hope and optimism are not the same. And even if your optimism, has diminished, one can still cling to hope, and one can be a prisoner even of hope, and be unwilling to relinquish hope. So I think what we need to do as a nation is really to cling to hope, even when our optimism wanes.
Jason, some response to that?
Sure. I think one name that hasn't come up in this discussion, despite the fact that we're talking about a social contract, is John Locke, which I find odd because Locke wasn't the first person to theorize on the social contract. You can go back to the Leviathan and Hobbes before him. You can go to Rousseau after him, but Locke is the one who had the most influence on our founders, particularly Jefferson and Madison. It was his theory that they had in mind when constructing the Declaration of Independence and writing the Constitution. I think Jefferson called him one of the three greatest men who ever lived. But his view of the social contract in the context of his view of natural rights and inalienable rights, life, liberty, and so forth, and that the government existed to protect those individual freedoms. That was the purpose. And I offer that backdrop because we've been talking about the social contract in terms of outcomes, in terms of disparate outcomes in society. And I don't think that's what Locke really had in mind, that this will be a failure if outcomes aren't equal across races and genders and ethnicities and so forth. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's not what he had in mind. It was aspirational, it was a theory, it was utopian. And I'm hesitant to measure its worth based on outcomes, or to base whether it's working or not based on outcomes and outcomes alone. I don't think that's how the progenitor of this idea that our founders found so attractive looked at the situation. There is a tendency to see unequal outcomes as ipso facto, a priori evidence of something evil going on. I think we should guard against doing that. Equal outcomes are not the norm, not in America, not today, not yesterday, not outside of America, not in other countries down through history. This idea that you'd have proportionate outcomes. If Blacks are 13% of the population, we should see them as 13% of law partners or 13% of the freshman class at Stanford. That's not what you see in history. You don't see anything approximating those types of outcomes in history. And it's odd that we would assume you'd find them, particularly in a place like America, where people from so many different places on earth geographically have come with backgrounds and cultures that have different attitudes, different skills, different behaviors, have all come to this country. And the idea that you'd mix all these people together and poof, you'd see equal outcomes in terms of achievement, economically, educationally, representation, the professions, and so forth, I think is somewhat unrealistic. Just to end with a quick data point, the income disparity between Eastern Europe and Western Europe per capita incomes are greater than the income disparity between Blacks and whites in America. And in Europe, you're talking about, of course, mostly people of the same race. So that's just one way to keep in mind, is this focus on outcomes and unequal outcomes being evidence that something nefarious is going on. I think we should guard against that. Obviously, racism can lead to unequal outcomes. Obviously, racism still exists, but it does not naturally follow that everywhere we see unequal outcomes, it is due to racism.
I have a question I'd like to throw out there for our keynote speakers. About a dozen years ago, as a tourist, I went to Vietnam, and I covered all north and south, all parts of the country. And of course, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of different specific talks you can go to about the Vietnam War. But in Vietnam, it's not the Vietnam War, it's the American War. So my question to the two of you is this. We're taught history from textbooks as we go through our different phases of school, from elementary to middle school to high school. In your comings and goings, have you seen that the teachings in the northern part of the country is different from the teachings from the southern part of the country?
It's not something I've looked at or looked at closely. In fact, to give you any kind of definitive answer, I wouldn't even be able to tell you anecdotally. It's just not something I've looked at.
Yeah, let me say I haven't studied that in particular, but I do think that you're onto something when you talk about teaching and education as playing a role in our where we are. I do think that there is such a pressure within American society for us to tell a happy story about ourselves, that we always tend to focus on the high points of the American story, and we don't have much inclination to address some of the more sordid details, if you will, of the past. I remember when my oldest son was very young, they had a class in school, and they were talking about the Civil War and how the Civil War ended slavery. And that was kind of the high point. And then they talked about the Civil Rights Movement. And he raised a question in class. He said, well, what happened after the end of slavery? And what happened after the end of slavery was that the North enforced the end of slavery for about a decade. And then after that, they turned it back over to the South, after which the South reinstated sort of a quasi-slavery, if you will. And he learned nothing about that in school. And when he raised that point, the teacher quickly shut it down and the class moved on because it wasn't a conversation that they wanted to have. And I've had the same sort of experiences as a faculty member even. I'm almost ashamed to say that it wasn't just several years ago when I learned the full story about our President Abraham Lincoln, which Professor Lopez Littleton mentioned. And one of the little tidbits of that story is that while we think of the 13th Amendment as having abolished slavery, there was actually a prior version of the 13th Amendment, which Lincoln spoke of approvingly. That prior version of the 13th Amendment, which was never enacted because the Civil War broke out, that prior version would have prohibited the abolition of slavery and would have prohibited an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery. Lincoln was so committed to keeping the Union together that he would have actually permitted slavery indefinitely if that's what was necessary to do so. Now, most people don't know about that part of the story, but those parts, kind of the darker side of our history, those I think are important parts to know about, important things that we should learn about and that we should teach children about so that they can have a fuller vision and understanding of the nation in all its glory and also in all its shame.
Darshell, is there a question that you would like to ask our keynote speakers at this time?
Yes, so I wanted to kind of recap about something that Mr. Riley said earlier about the equal aspects of things and how we're 13% of a nation and how could we actually relate that. But I also am asking a question that one of our attendees is asking. They said Stevie Winkler says that many speakers have said that there has never been a social contract for the equality of Black and Brown communities. If a social contract was created today, what would that look like? So keeping in mind of all of the panelists' interpretations and such, what do you, the keynotes, think a social contract should look like or would look like today?
Well, it's not literal. I mean, it's an idea. It's a concept. the social contract is the agreement of the people to give some authority to a government, so long as that government, in a sense, doesn't abuse it too much. And it therefore should be a representative government in case it does have any sort of is tempted to abuse it. Then we can replace the individuals before they act on those temptations. And it says that if the government does not protect our freedoms, then we have the right to overthrow it as the people, to get rid of it. I mean, that's the social contract. I mean, again, the Hobbes's version is a little more cynical about it than Locke's, but that was the general idea. That was, so it was implicit. It's not something literal. So today, I think there is that idea that still exists in terms of, if every 4 years we vote, and if we don't like what we see in Washington, we get to change it. In terms of Congress, every 2 years. In terms of the Senate, every 6 years. Then you have your state and local governments as well. But it's divided government. It's meant to the checks and balances are there for a reason. I think all of these were an effort on the part of the founders and the framers of the Constitution to, they were written with that social contract in the back of their mind. And I think that basic framework has held up well for a couple hundred years now, quite well. Is it perfect? No, but of course you're always asking compared to what? What would you replace it with is the real question.
Yeah. And let me add in just a note or two about John Locke, which Jason mentioned earlier. And I have not thought about Locke in a while. I used to think about Locke a fair amount when I taught property, because Locke talked a lot about the importance of the individual right to property. And I taught that probably for some years before I realized that the individual right was really only part of the Lockean story of property. Because the other part of the story was that Locke insisted that when one takes property and develops property through one's labor, one has an entitlement to that property, but one also has to leave, I think the words were, as much and as good for everyone else. In other words, one has a right to property, but not to the extent that one takes all the property, because property is not simply an individual entitlement, it also has to be a system. And we don't have property without having a system. So that's what I would say we need to give more emphasis to, is the effect of individual actions within our system. Whether we are talking about property rights or more broadly, we can talk about our economic system. And the point where we are now, frankly, is that people feel that they have such an entitlement to what they see as the fruits of their labor that we have a very small group of people who are hoarding the resources for themselves so that other people don't have enough left to live meaningful lives. And that's true especially for African Americans, and it's reflected in rates of incarceration and life expectancy and health and unemployment. But that's also true for people of all races. And that's what worries me the most, and what I think really does imperil our nation.
Vanessa, please go ahead and fire some questions at our distinguished keynotes.
Yeah, thank you guys for a wonderful conversation. And I'm happy to chime in here for a moment. And I'd like to circle back to this notion about outcomes, because much of the work that I do focuses on saving lives, which is an outcome, right? And so, when I think about social contract theory, I'm thinking about the social institutions and laws that are necessary for people to function as members of a society. So there is this exchange of social benefit with burden. And I think about paying taxes and following laws. And so my question is kind of in that same vein about, Black people paying taxes that support healthcare systems, yet they have different outcomes. We pay health insurance into these systems, but we have different outcomes. The same can be said for education and the criminal justice system. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts and your reflections about how or what should we expect from these systems that we are supporting and paying into. Is it your supposition that this is normal and that this is okay, and this is what we should expect from these American institutions? Thank you.
Wow. Well, let me just say, I mean, these are all questions that could lead to entire other conversations, full conversations. So let me just say a little, which is that, my big worry is that we don't understand sufficiently how not only precious, but fragile our system is. I think more people understand the fragility of our system now than would have been the case 10 years ago. But we have a system that is a fragile system. And what we need to do to bolster that system is we really do need to see all of our fellow Americans, all of the people in this nation, we need to see each other as brothers and sisters. And that means that, we're not going to be as concerned about, clinging to what's ours and holding on to that. We're also going to be concerned about in short sharing with others and trying to devise a system that works well for everyone. And it doesn't mean equal outcomes across the board in every domain, but it does mean that when we talk about basic indicators of well-being, health, housing, ability to get an education, ability to hold a meaningful job, those ability to participate politically, those basic indicators of well-being have to be broadly available for everyone in the society. And if they're not available for everyone in the society, the outcome, and I think of this in March Madness time period, since we're in the midst of March Madness and the NCAA tournament, the outcome is not going to be that one team wins and some other team loses. It's going to be that the game just won't continue. And that's what we need to avoid.
John, I'll turn it back to you for a follow-up.
I don't really have a question. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question. I'll put it this way. I agree with, I gotta get the name straight here, with Professor Banks. And I also agree with Professor Riley and Vanessa, who I know, and Ms. Burnett.
Sounds like we have too much.
So how do I do all of that? One of the things that I'm thinking that has changed between when this started and now, for me, is that I'm less pessimistic than I was at the beginning when I said, and I was pessimistic, I wasn't playing about that. The issue is, it shows what this whole thing shows is the importance of education, the importance of seeing both sides of the issue, and that's what's come out here. So the idea is that the purpose of the debate is not to make up anybody's mind, but to make it so difficult that you can't make up your mind without thinking about it. And that's what I see coming out of here. I'm thinking about what Mr. Riley has said about what's going on that end, and then what Professor Lopez has said, and what Ms. Burnett is saying. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, I got to rebalance things here a little bit. So this really does speak to, as you said earlier, the importance of education in terms of all of this. And it gets lost. I think that another one of those personal feelings here, I think that the importance of education in the culture itself is lost. Just education for the purpose of education. Knowing John Locke. the whole thing about John Locke, and I'll end with this, I'm going on too long. The whole thing about John Locke is perfect because today I talked about John Locke. Okay. And I told my students they should come. We just finished talking about Hobbes, and boy, you guys make me look like a genius. Okay.
Well, you sound like you are providing a true education, right? Which is what students need. So, but let me just add on education though, because education is really the hope. I mean, we live in a world economy where technology has advanced, the jobs and the labor market have changed in ways that education is going to be ever more important in enabling people to lead meaningful lives. The problem is that in our society, we have allowed education to be something that is available on unequal terms, depending on families' wealth and geography. In other words, who your parents are, how much money they have, where you live, from the time you're a young child on through your adulthood, that can determine the quality of education that you receive. And in a better society, that would not be the case. The quality of education that a 5 or 8 or 15-year-old receives should not depend on who their parents are.
I would just add one reason I'm more optimistic than a lot of folks seem to be on this panel is because I really don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here when it comes to addressing these disparities. We sort of speak as though the way things are now is the way they've always been, particularly for the Black underclass, and in terms of racial disparities everywhere from income and employment to schooling and so forth. And that's not quite the case. Professor Banks spoke earlier about, I believe it was an anecdote involving school and teaching the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War, and Reconstruction and so forth. There's a lot of rich Black history that was taking place during that period, even when we saw a lot of political retrogression. The Blacks were making tremendous economic gains in the first half of the 20th century. Between 1940 and 1960, for example, the Black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. That's before the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. That's before affirmative action. A 40-point drop in the Black poverty rate. Blacks were entering the skilled professions at unprecedented rates. Again, I'm not talking about maids or butlers or chauffeurs. I'm talking about teachers and social workers and lawyers and doctors. In the 1940s and 50s, the number of such individuals grew fivefold. Black incomes, Black home ownership rates grew at a much faster rate than they did among whites during this era. The Black marriage rate in every census from the 1890s to the 1940s was slightly higher than the white marriage rate in this country. We see single parenting among Blacks and the effects it's had, and we're like, oh, what can anything be done to reverse it? This is not the way it has always been, and I think this history is not as well known and not discussed as often as it should be. But there's a lot there to learn from. What was going right back then in Black America, notwithstanding the circumstances of Jim Crow and racism and so forth. A lot was going right, and I think that era warrants a lot more study and consideration in terms of what can be done to turn things around today.
Yeah. And I think these are important observations that I agree with. And factually, I mean, I think Jason is correct, right? That there was much more Black progress prior to the civil rights era than we commonly recognize. So we should not equate progress with laws being passed, right? Those are not the same. But it's also the case that that progress occurred before we had the extraordinary economic restructuring of society, the deindustrialization of the 1970s and 80s, the advances in technology, which have bifurcated the labor market. So you have some people making extraordinary amounts of money at the top and other people struggling to get by at the bottom. So, this progress occurred prior to the economic situation that we're confronting now, which is one of globalization and technological change that has dramatically reconfigured the labor market for everyone, and which has led to widespread economic anxiety. And what I think we need to recognize is that the inequalities that have been nurtured by this economic restructuring, they're going to hurt a lot of white people, but they're also going to hurt a lot of Black people, and they're going to fuel racism in a lot of ways. So our challenge now, I think, is not to try to go back to some earlier era where things were better. It's to try to figure out how do we make the economy work for everyone when the jobs that people have had in the past, large numbers of those jobs have actually disappeared. And the jobs that will be available in the future will look different than anything we've ever seen in our history.
Darshell, would you like to follow up with a question?
Yes, I actually found Mr. Riley's point very interesting because a lot of us, especially me, I'm still on my journey of learning and I'm still trying to know what it is to be Black in America as I'm, in this adulting life. I've been in the adulting life since 21. That's 3 years, I think, 4 years. I'm really bad at math today. But it's just about learning history and that educational piece. But I'm also curious because both of y'all had interesting points about learning about the past and about acknowledging what the past has to offer and what the past shows about the growth of Black people. What do y'all think about cultural anxieties and how individuals internalize the negative pieces of our history, and it creates internalized obstacles for them? And how do individuals who use those bright points in Black history to best develop their sense of, I don't want to say intelligence, but like for instance, Dr. Riley, you were talking, or Mr. Riley, you were talking about how we often forget those pieces of the past when we're talking about oppression and stuff. And so what are your thoughts about cultural anxieties?
Well, I think culture is hugely important. I would argue that the cultural barriers to Black advancement, particularly the Black underclass, are far larger than any racial prejudicial systemic barriers today. I do think the opportunities are there, and the challenge is to ready yourself to take advantage of them. And culture has often gotten in the way of that. And the larger culture, I think is a problem insofar as Blacks are sort of encouraged to harp on racism and victimization, and it gets used as a crutch, I think, far too often. And I think that is a problem. You send, as I said in my little talk, when you send people out into the world with a chip on their shoulder, when you tell a kid it's a racist test, it's a racist system, racist employers, that's going to affect the effort put into that kid trying to make something of himself. And I think one of the reasons this persists, I believe in incentives. I believe in trade-offs, and I try and look at this economically. I've often looked at it economically in my work, But one of the reasons is that this persists is that there's a market for it out there. There's a grievance industry in this country that stays relevant, that makes a lot of money off of explaining to Black people that all of their problems are the fault of white people. That is a lucrative business in this country, and there's a racial spoils system in this country, and so long as that exists, you are going to have a group of people, a group of individuals playing that up. There are economic benefits to playing that up, even if it's not true, even if it's not helping the Black underclass succeed or improve. There are incentives to keep these issues first and foremost, regardless of whether they are relevant to the people you're trying to help. But in terms of culture, yes, I talk about culture all the time. It gets me in all kinds of trouble.
Yeah. Let me just add. I mean, I agree that culture is important, and we should pay attention to culture. But it's also the case that when you talk about African Americans, African Americans have been here for many, many generations. And the culture that you see, for example, on the south side of Chicago is a consequence in part of the situations in which people have lived in American society. It's a consequence, I know in my family, it's a consequence of the terrorism that my parents and their parents endured in the South. That created a certain culture, the fact that they were subject to racial terrorism. And, that's not to blame anyone, but that is to say that if you have a neat divide between culture on one hand and, the government or the society or businesses on the other, that's probably the wrong way to think about it, because the cultures that people develop are actually a consequence of the circumstances and situations in which they found themselves over generations. And those situations and circumstances are a consequence of factors that are much broader than that particular people.
Well, we're at a point in time that I would like to start going through some audience Q&A. So I'll be starting off with a question, and of course, both Rick and Jason, please kind of chime in with your opinions. And if the panelists, you have something to add to that as well, please do. But we have a question here that's kind of, in my opinion, timely. But let's first go back in time a bit to the presidential debates that we were having on the Democratic side. And Andrew Yang had a proposal about $1,000 per month of a basic income for all Americans. Well, just the other day, we're all reading about the city of Oakland coming up with something similar for $500 a month for their citizens. So my question to you would be, what impact would this have on the perspective of racism in America? And how would you go about saying that's a pro or con about just throwing money at people? It'd be tax-free, of course. So
I'll say it sounds like a bad thing when you say throw money at it, but the UBI, Universal Basic Income, is an idea that has been floated and discussed among academics and other commentators for many decades now. And it's a complicated question because obviously you might worry about people's incentives to work. If you set the amount at the wrong level, people won't have much incentive to work. So, I don't want to try to offer some, ultimate answer given how much the details matter. But I will say that we need to do a better job in terms of enabling people to meet some of their basic needs in life. And we do not do nearly as good of a job on that score as many European democracies. And that's a shame. And that's a failing of our nation. I encounter this every day, by the way, because I'm teach at Stanford and actually live on campus. If you go 5 feet off the Stanford campus, you have people who are homeless and who are living in cars because they cannot afford housing. right? That's not the sort of society that we should live in. And if UBI is a way to address that problem, that's an argument in support of UBI.
I think we've already gone down this road some distance. And I think before we continue, we should look at what the results have been so far. I mean, if redistributing wealth, if sending people checks solved poverty, my goodness, we would have solved this a long time ago. What were the Great Society programs about? How many trillions of dollars did we spend redistributing wealth in this country over the past half century? What have the results been? And as I mentioned earlier, what were the results specifically among Blacks prior to the Great Society programs when it came to reducing poverty? Those poverty rates I mentioned did not come down because the government was sending out checks to Black people. That's not what was happening. I think we want to look at, not only the incentives that are put in place, but just simply whether what we've tried so far in this regard has worked or not. I think the focus ought to be on wealth creation, not wealth redistribution. If the thinking is that poor people are poor because they have no money, if you simply give them some money, they won't be poor anymore. If it were that simple, I think we would have solved poverty a long time ago.
Well, I don't know if that's actually.
One other thing about the European comparison, because I believe the professor is right there. They do have much larger welfare states. They have for a long time. It certainly seems the direction that the current administration wants to go in, moving toward that sort of democratic socialist model that you see in Europe. But there are trade-offs. European countries typically have higher unemployment rates and lower productivity rates than we have here in the US. So it is another way to run an economy, but there are going to be some trade-offs. There's no free lunch here.
Yeah, I agree there are going to be some trade-offs, but I do think, and I'll take off my academic hat and just put on my regular person hat. I do think that if people are hungry because they don't have food, giving them food will in fact solve that problem. That sometimes it actually really is that simple. If people are hungry, they need food. If we gave them food, they would not be hungry. That would solve a large part of the problem. And I think that's also true with people not having adequate resources to meet their basic human needs. If people don't have money to find housing or to access education or to go to the doctor or whatever else they need to do, providing them money actually would go a long way towards solving that problem. And when I hear people say, well, we've tried that before, we did what we always do when it comes to addressing serious social problems, or often do, which is that we see a problem and we say, oh, we're going to address this, and we do so for a few years. And then we kind of pull back and say, oh, well, that's not working. So we had the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. By the early 70s, the backlash and the entrenchment had already begun. So that's about how long we tried it, right? After slavery, we tried Reconstruction and to help the freed slaves. 10 years later, we said, okay, been there, done that, let's give up. What more is it that they need, right? So we do have this historical pattern, especially when it comes to addressing racial inequities, that we do something, but we don't do it for long. And then we give up and say, see, it didn't work.
Well, with respect to addressing poverty, I don't think that's quite fair. I mean, the war on poverty begins in the 1960s, building on programs of the Great Society in some cases, and then starting new programs. After Johnson leaves, Nixon expands these programs exponentially. Ford does the same thing after Nixon. So we're talking a couple decades of huge expansions of the US welfare state during this period. and then you look at the studies done on poverty. And the 1996 welfare reform, Professor, was largely about the excesses of this because of the incentives that had been put in place. We woke up in the late 80s and early 90s and said, my goodness, we're paying someone more money to stay at home than they can make using their skills at a job. Of course they're going to stay at home. Incentives matter. That's how lopsided this plan had gotten. And
I agree with all of that. Yep. No, I agree with all of that. I do agree. I mean, the chronology is correct, but let me tell you, the most important resource we can distribute, this goes back to an earlier comment, the single most important resource we can redistribute is actually educational opportunity. When Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954, for the next decade, there was no redistribution of educational opportunity at all. You can count on your fingers and toes the number of Black students in the entire southern part of the United States who actually went to a quality school that was desegregated. We had the Civil Rights Acts that were then passed, right, that prohibited racial segregation and discrimination. That was in the mid-60s. And then, Jason, by the early 70s, when Nixon ran, Nixon actually ran on a platform that was opposed to busing, opposed to school integration, and that signaled to everyone, you know, we've tried this education thing, we're gonna give up on that. And the Supreme Court sadly capitulated in that, so that today, our schools are by some measures no more integrated than they were half a century ago. In fact, in some regard, in some ways, they are more segregated socioeconomically now than they were then. So that's actually, in this economy that we're living in now, the key resource is educational opportunity, and that's a resource that we have not been able to muster the will to redistribute. So, you know, God bless you if you are the child of an affluent person, or if you're my child, right? And you have parents who can situate you in the right spot. But if you are a child born in the south side of Chicago to the wrong family, your outlook is bleak. And it's bleak for reasons that have everything to do with the lack of resources available to you. And it's bleak for reasons that are in no way your fault as a young child.
I would have to strongly disagree with that.
Which part?
Well, first of all, it's true that Nixon opposed school busing, but so did most Black people. It was the NAACP. It were the Black elites that supported busing. Rank and file Black people never wanted to put their kids on buses.
Well, rank and file Black people.
A couple hours every day. They wanted good schools built right there in the neighborhood. They did not want busing, but that's a minor disagreement. The larger disagreement has to do with your connection between resources and education. If you look at per pupil spending in places like Washington, D.C. or Newark, New Jersey, you will see that they are spending well above the state average and well above the national average per pupil on education. This is not a question of resources. This is a question of political will and offering these kids the choice to attend a better school. And the reason they do not have that choice, if you're that kid on the south side of Chicago, is because you can't afford to move to a nice suburb with a better public school system. And the money being spent on your public school is not given to you to go use at a private school or a Catholic school or somewhere else where they will take it. On top of that, they won't let charter schools, public charter schools, be built to accommodate the demand for them, particularly among Black parents. Yeah. So these are the problems, I think, the barriers that are in the way of a better education for the Black underclass. It's not a question of not spending enough money on the problem. We spend plenty of money on education in this country. How that money is spent, how it's distributed, and who controls where it goes is the problem. And right now, as we've learned with these lockdowns, the teachers' unions have a tremendous amount of control over our public education system. They don't want kids having school choice. They don't want those charter schools built. They don't want kids attending private and Catholic schools because those schools tend not to be unionized. They are standing in the way, I think, of a better education for these young Black kids, not a lack of resources per se.
So let me just note a point of agreement there, because I am a supporter of charter schools. My son is working in the charter school industry, so to speak. Some of my best friends actually are involved in the charter school industry. So I am a supporter of whatever leads to better education for more people, in particular Black and brown people who have been on the short end of that stick. So I agree with you there. And it's also the case that, you know, a lot of these urban schools in DC in particular, well, first of all, they can waste a lot of money. That's true. And they also do spend more money than sometimes than we might think, than even suburban schools, or they might spend more money than schools in other countries. But part of the reason they do that is because our social safety net is so thin. So when the schools close down here in California, one of the things that people realize is that a lot of families rely on their school for food. We have families who have no other way to have meals for their children other than to receive them in the school. So one of the things the schools are spending money on is providing basic services and basic goods like food to children that in a better society people would have available. So that's just a tidbit to show that, once again, the thinness of our social safety net is something that, you know, it might seem distant from someone who is, you know, affluent and well-educated, but from tens of millions of kids out there, they are just a step away from deprivation in the most serious way. And that's not a circumstance that we would allow our own children to experience. And I don't think that's a circumstance that we should allow our nation's children to experience.
Well, I think with that remark, we're going to close up shop for this year's wonderful Ethics and Responsibility Forum. So now for the audience, I would like to ask you to please take the poll that's going to appear on your screen. Who is for the motion that the U.S. social contract has been broken, and who is against that motion? So please take a moment and put your vote in.
I'm disappointed that the host and panelists cannot vote.
So I'll ask our organizers behind the scenes, how's the polling coming along? I don't know how they do it on TV game shows, but they say we're going to take a poll, and about 4 seconds later, they said, okay, the votes are in. So, all right. I think I see some results here coming in. And there it is. Our ta-da moment. So thank you for sharing that. All right, and thank you. All right. So at this time, let me say a wonderful thank you to the people behind the scenes, also known as our organizing committee. So can we show all their pictures or their names, whatever works to give them wonderful acknowledgement? There they are on the screen there. So thank you, organizing committee. Of course, thank you so much to our keynote speakers and the panelists. You were wonderful, vibrant. The time flew by. I want to thank the respective deans of the colleges for making this all possible. Andrew Lawson, Andrew Drummond, Alan Hoffman, and of course, Sham Kamath. And the biggest thank you goes to all of you, our vast viewing audience. Good evening, everyone. Please stay safe and healthy. Good night.